Today I want to talk about freedom of speech. Now, I don't know if you've been following the news at all, but Tommy Robinson over in England, he's in prison right now because of... And what did he do? Well, he spoke out against the Muslim sex grooming gangs. And there's also people serving time now for speaking out against abortion. Actually, in England, they have thought police. You can't even go anywhere near an abortion clinic and pray because they can come and lock you up for not verbally praying, but praying to yourself. Now, so why is that a problem? Well, it isn't really a big problem yet in America, but I see it coming. Now, it wasn't too long ago, the Methodist Church, when it got started, it was a powerhouse of evangelists. They used to call them the Shouting Methodists. And you may be aware of the Red Cross and the Salvation Army. All these started out as Christian movements. The Salvation Army, Catherine Booth and William Booth, they started out as street evangelists. But today, when you think of the Salvation Army, normally what you think of is somebody ringing a bell and begging for money at around Christmas time. And so, why am I bringing this up, especially standing out here in front of a church? Well, the reason I'm bringing it up is you can still get by in America with a sign on your vehicle or a bumper sticker that might offend somebody. But if you go to certain churches, like this one here, it says all are welcome on the bottom of their sign. But my wife and I went here about 3 or 4 times over the past few months. And then a few days ago, I got a call from the pastor. And he said, as long as... Good. He said, as long as you're driving that truck, you're not welcome in our church. So I just want to give him some publicity today because apparently he doesn't believe in freedom of speech.
So is there a problem with this church or anything?
Well, as you could probably see, I got cut off in the middle of my little video I was doing out in front of the church by some guy that wanted to know what it was all about. And he was a pleasant enough guy. He was a Christian guy. So he was just curious, and we had a pretty good chat. But I just want to address some of the problems that you run into in situations like this. It's, it's good to keep a proper attitude, and you have to kind of put yourself in the shoes of the pastor. And I have no idea, what the history is there. But I can guess, because I've been a pastor, so I know the type of things that you run into. I mean, years ago, I was pastoring a small church in a very wealthy, liberal environment. And after a couple of years, my wife and I, we get out, stirred up with people, and talk to people in public. And of course, just long before people begin to connect the dots, what church you're involved with. And it wasn't long before I had 5 pastors on this. We actually lived on an island, and I had 5 pastors put together a letter, and they all signed it. And these are all, of course, liberal pastors, the gay affirming type. And they published this letter in the newspaper stating that I wasn't I wasn't speaking for all the Christians of the island where we lived. And they just wanted to let know the public that I wasn't a good expression of the body of Christ. So that's the kind of peer pressure you get from other ministers. Then, if you have somebody on your board of your church, and of course most pastors, if they're not working a full-time job, paying their bills, and they're being supported by the tithes and offerings of the church, there's a certain amount of financial strain and pressure that you have to learn to deal with. And sometimes the church will use that as leverage to dictate what you address and what you don't address. And in my situation, it wasn't long before the gay community began to come after us and put pressure on us. In fact, one day I got a call from a police officer, and he wanted me to come and talk to him, and so I did. I went down to the police station, and he says, I want you to know right up front, I'm on your side here. I'm a Christian. I said, oh, that's good to know. But he says, I just want to give you a heads up that we've been getting a lot of complaints from the gay community around here. And he says, they're after you. And I went, well, that's good to know. And so they begin to put pressure on us. And of course, we're not shy about confronting the gay agenda. And at one point, I was downtown Seattle and picked up a copy of the Seattle Gay newspaper. And there was a large ad in the paper. It was a fundraiser for something called Digital Queers Northwest. And a lot of the businesses that were involved in it, Thomas Kemper Brewery was one, Washington Mutual Bank, and a bunch of computer businesses. They all had their logos on this ad. So, I thought, well, at the time, Washington Mutual Bank, which no longer exists, they were advertising as a bank with family values. So me and another guy, we put together a Christian statement, published a little article, and put together some signs, and we went and stood in front of the local branch of the bank. And of course, it isn't long before, of course, the bank is pretty shook up about it because, the local bank really wasn't behind this. It was the corporate folks over in Seattle probably that instigated the whole thing. But of course, they have to live with it because they're part of the corporation. So anyway, it isn't long before a couple of three-piece suits show up, and of course, they're obviously members of the gay community, and they want to know who we were with. Well, I learned a long time ago, don't get your church involved in something like that, because if you got somebody that's a little immature or weak-willed in your church, especially on the board, they're going to be pitching a fit and want you to go away. And then if there's lawsuits involved, of course, they're going to freak out. So I said, well, it's just us and Jesus. If you have a problem with me, you probably have a problem with him. And they, of course, they just rolled their eyes, how religious nut. And they left. And a few minutes later, a couple of police officers showed up and wanted to know if I had a permit. And I said, well, yeah, as a matter of fact, I'm a U.S. citizen. I have First Amendment rights here. We're standing on a public sidewalk. Oh, no, you have to have a special permit here on this island. And I said, no kidding. That I want to see. Well, they were quick and ready for me, and they gave me their card and had the ordinance written down on the back of their card. And so I promptly walked down to City Hall and had the clerk look it up for me. What they were trying to impose on me was a parade ordinance, which meant I had to run it by City Hall, I had to pay for a permit, and then I had to pay for a police escort. See, this is a way of blowing you off. And I said, you can't enforce this. This is unconstitutional. And of course, the clerk, he didn't know what to say. And I said, I need to talk to the chief of police. Well, the chief of police, he happened to be in the office within 15 or 20 feet of where I was standing, and he overheard our conversation. And he comes out, and I said, Chief, you can't enforce this. This is unconstitutional. And he says, well, try me. This is my island. I went, no kidding. That's where you want to go with this. And so to make a long story short, I turned it over to some attorneys, and it took a few months, but I was on several radio talk shows with my attorney, and I was in the Bremerton Sun, I was in the Seattle Times and the PI and the local paper, and they ended up having to pay my attorneys $10,000, and they had to basically recant their attack on me. So that's what you're dealing with, see. And so this poor pastor that's at this Alliance Church chances are he's got somebody on his board, or somebody that's got a gay kid, or somebody that's a Mormon, or somebody that's got Muslim friends or something. Anybody that's on the list of those things that are on my sign in my truck, see, those people are going to be offended. Well, the difference between an evangelist and a pastor is, see, the pastor has to live with the people. He's got to put up with their nonsense. Well, an evangelist don't. And so, as an evangelist, I don't have a whole lot of time for it. I just preach the truth and try to be as honest as possible and polite, but I'm not going to compromise. And see, if if a pastor is stressed out financially and the board begins to put pressure on him, of course he's afraid, what am I going to do? Especially if he has no skills, job skills. Or if he's an older guy, it's not like he's going to go out and be able to pound nails or paint houses or something like that. So, these are some of the challenges that pastors have, and every pastor has to learn to get over it. They have to exercise a different level of faith when these kind of things happen, and you can't be dictated by financial pressure or liberal pressure. Now, see, what happens too is especially if you're confronted with this gay agenda thing, and they get some attorneys to put pressure on you, well, your church might not have the finances to deal with it, or maybe they don't think they have, but the reality is there are plenty of attorneys in America that will represent you pro bono, and I know because that's who represented me. I had several attorneys give me advice, and one of the things that they told me, nearly every one of them, what they told me was, we have little towns all over America that are trying to pull this kind of stunt. And they encouraged me to continue to go forward with it because they said if they can get away with it, there's no end. So you can't let them get away with it. But a lot of Christians, they cave in because they think, well, hey, I've got kids in school, I could lose my job, blah, blah, blah. And of course, there's all kinds of pressure that comes with it. Well, my wife and I, we've tried to be very careful about not getting in debt to the point to where they can use that kind of pressure on us. And so, anyway, so you need to pray for this pastor, and we'll see what comes of it. Yeah, something else too that's worth mentioning is that, that we are, as Christians, we're all part of the body of Christ. We're all hands and feet, eyes, and ears. And Apostle Paul addresses this in his letter to the Corinthians, that you can't say, you can't reject one part just because they don't quite fit in with your tradition. And so sometimes God will send people to your church basically to confront issues that you've been running away from. And to some degree, that gives you an out because you don't have to do it. So, in Ephesians, it says there's apostles, prophets, evangelists, pastors, and teachers. And the problem with a lot of churches is they might have a pastor, and they might even have a board. Sometimes the board might be handpicked people by the pastor, which that can be a problem because he's going to pick people maybe that agree with him. So depending on what kind of prejudice or weakness he has, those are going to be guys that, maybe support him in whatever those problems might be. So if God sends to your church somebody with a prophetic voice or an evangelistic gift, if you reject all the evangelists that are in your church, it isn't long before your church is going to be dead. Because evangelists are the one that challenge people and get people saved for the most part. Now, occasionally somebody wanders into a church and they're broken and they're, pretty easy. Of course, everybody wants the fruit that's easy to pick, right? And that's what pastors want, somebody that's just ripe and ready to get saved. But the evangelists get out and they challenge people, and That's a kind of an uncomfortable position to be in a church, and a pastor has to learn to allow things to happen because the sparks are going to fly. That's just the nature of the business. And the pastor is somewhat like a referee. He has to be able to oversee, and of course, if there's wolves that come into the church, you got to deal with them. But if it's just somebody that's a different expression of the body of Christ, if they have evangelistic zeal, or maybe they play a different style of music than what you're used to in your worship team. And that's always a battleground. I've been involved in a number of worship teams over the years. And there's always a battleground there trying to figure out, how to balance out the different styles of music so that you can appeal to everybody's tradition and prejudice and whatever, their likes and dislikes. And so, anyway, that's my 2 bits, and you can keep the change.